Yeah, it's different. Experimenting techniques.
Last night there was no one here to record. I'm not sure if this should happen.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Erev Tov. So we're back online, back on the cloud tonight. I wanted to talk about, you are probably aware, certainly the Englishmen that are here, are aware that over the past weekend was the coronation of the king in England. And what's that? Yeah, they had the oil, right? So a lot has been said about this. I want to look at one very interesting halachic question which comes up. So a lot was made about the fact that the chief rabbi was in attendance and other rabbis, and there's discussion regarding entering a church. Not getting into that sugya right now, but that was one discussion that comes up. There was also the fact that the rabbi was invited to sleep over at the palace, so he'd be able to walk over on Shabbat morning. It was actually reported that initially the royal family wanted, or those organizing the ceremony, they wanted the chief rabbi to come in the official convoy. He said he can't travel by car. They said, okay, we'll get you a wagon and a carriage with horses. He said, thank you, I'll come by foot. But that was another issue. There was the fact that there was a part of the service actually where the chief rabbi spoke with a number of other faith leaders, and it was noted they did that without a microphone to make accommodation for Shabbat. One thing which I did not see discussed, which is an interesting question, is whether those who are in attendance would have, should have, or did make the bracha on seeing the king. We know that there is a bracha that one makes upon seeing royalty. This is in the Gemara and in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's an interesting discussion. We find a lot of debate amongst the Achronim as to whether this bracha applies nowadays or not. We don't find much debate amongst the Rishonim because in those days a king was a king and a queen was a queen. There was no question, whether they had power, whether they had authority, whether they had that, royalty was what it is. Nowadays, the question is it somebody who's just maybe a figurehead, is just symbolic? Maybe that symbolism in and of itself is reason to make the bracha. So this is the discussion. I'll just say, to open up, I'm reminded, there's a very powerful, moving piece in Rav Soloveitchik, where he talks about when he was a child, learning in Cheder. And he says that their Rebbe was a Chabad Chassid. And he said to them, and when they learned about Rosh Hashanah, so he said, who knows what, tonight is the coronation. So he didn't call Rosh Hashanah Karanatzianach. And he said, tonight is the coronation night. Who knows who we are coronating? So he said, child who would later become Rav Soloveitchik says, Tsar Nicholas. So the teacher said, no, he's not a real king. In any ways, he already has his crown. He says, we're crowning the King of Kings, Melech Malchem Lachem, Kadosh Baruch Hu. So do you know who puts the crown on his head? And when you see the ceremony that's just taken place, Lahavdil, but you see how official and all the thousands of troops and the pageantry and the ceremony and the rehearsals that must have gone into it. And not just anybody can come along and put on the crown. So he says, who puts the crown on his head? And the teacher said, the crown on the head of the King of Kings, so to speak. He said, it's Yankel the tailor, and it's Zalman the shoemaker, and it's David the butcher. He says, that's the one who puts on. Said Rav Soloveitchik. He said, of all the discourses and all the sermons and all the drashot I've given and all the shirim that I've learned, nothing has ever made me realize and feel the depth of what Rosh Hashanah is about than that lesson in that cheder. So that is something, and there's certainly something to be learned and to be seen when you watch the ceremony and you imagine what we're meant to gain from this. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, in fact, quoting from the Gemara, he says, "Mitzvah lishtader lirot malachim, afilu malchei umot haolam." There is a mitzvah; it's a good practice. One should try and go and see kings, right? Even non-Jewish kings, in order to get a sense of what royalty is, what royalty is about. The Mishnah Berurah points out over here, by the way, he says that once you've seen the king once, that's enough. You've got it. He says, that's enough. Now, from now on, it's B'tor Torah. You can go back, sit in Shiva and learn. If he comes with a greater, troops and ceremony around him, then you can go out and see again. I saw Rav Nevinsel writes in his notes to the Mishnah Berurah, he says this halacha would probably still apply today. It's about the bracha, not sure, but even to see the circumstances of the ceremony, he says that would probably apply. So the question is, do you say the bracha still nowadays on seeing the kings? And the Shulchan Aruch in the previous seif, he says the following. He says, I'm quoting the Gemara, על מלכי ישראל אומר, ברוך אתה השם אלוקינו מלך העולם, שחלק מכבודו ליראיו. So there is a different bracha if it's a Jewish king or a non-Jewish king. Jewish king, the bracha is, שחלק מכבודו, who has given over of his kavod, of his honor, his glory, ליראיו, to those who fear him. ועל מלכי אומות העולם, עובדי כוכבים, אומר, ברוך שנתן מכבודו לבשר ודם. So Hashem who has given over again, mikvodo, that is the common thread in both brachot, to basar v'dam, to flesh and blood. So does this bracha apply nowadays? So the Mishnah Berurah tells us, and he quotes here from the Radbaz, and from it's mentioned in some of the other achronim. He says, "Ashiltonim she'en ol melech alehem l'shanot divrehem, v'dan v'holeg b'mishpat." So you had sort of local governors, I suppose, who did not have the title of king, they don't have the title of royalty, but they had the authority of the royalty. And they are not subject to the king's orders, they are in charge, they have their own orders. And the key phrase here is V'dan v'oreg b'mishpat. He can decide in his judgment whether he has the power of life and death in his hands. He can decide to execute people off of their heads, whatever it may be. And that gives the king total authority, that gives him total power. Even if he does not have the name king over here, he says you would still mevarech. And then he says, "V'nasarim shmemanei melech b'chol ir va'ir." But the ministers who are underneath the authority of the king were appointed in each province. There, he says, "Tov yashal levarech b'lo shem v'malchut." We're not sure already that's b'shem v'malchut, but b'lo shem v'malchut, without saying Hashem's name, so it should not be a bracha levatala. So the poskim discuss, and really, essentially, there's two ways to read this Mishnah Berurah. One way is to say, what many of the Achronim discuss, that what makes the king, or the queen, what makes that royalty is this power of what we said, Dan Vareg B'Mishpat, that they have the power to exercise, to decide over one's life. And if they have that authority, then they are a fitting monarch over whom you can say the bracha. And if not. That is one understanding. You could, however, understand it slightly differently. To say that over here, the Mishnah, where do we invoke this idea that it has to be someone who has this authority? That's when they are not actually the king in name. That's when they don't have all the symbolism and all the pomp and ceremony that goes with it. But perhaps, if it's a king or a queen, even if they don't have the power of life and death, but they do have all the symbolism and all the honor and all the glory that comes with it, right? The changing of the guards and all of that. So then perhaps you would say. So this is let's say machloket between Achronei Zmanenu. Rav Wosner in Shevet HaLevi seems to say that yes, you could. The question everybody discusses nowadays is the King of England, but going back for the last 70 years, it was the Queen of England, right? Could you say the bracha and seeing the Queen of England? Rav Wosner says yes. Rav Wosner says you could say it. Rav Sternbuch, also who grew up in England as well, he writes that probably you could say the bracha. But he makes an interesting distinction as well, which is brought in some of the other poskim. He says, if the reason why we're saying the bracha over royalty is that you see them as royalty, so you have to see them as royalty. What if you were to see the king when he's out at his holiday resort in Scotland and he's not dressed in all the robes and all the crown? So then maybe not. Now, there was a story, it was published last year when the Queen was having her Jubilee. So one of the security guards told the following story, somebody who was the Queen's protection officer for many years. And he said on one occasion, when the Queen was at her holiday resort, and she went out for a picnic for lunch, and it was just the two of them, the Queen and her protection officer. And he says, he describes the scene, says these two American tourists came and saw them, and they could see immediately, they did not know, they see this old lady having a picnic, they had no idea that she was the Queen. So they start talking. And they say, where do you live? Are you from around here? She says, no, I have a holiday home here. Apparently, the Queen has a very good sense of humor. So she says, they say, so where are you from? She says, I'm from London. So, okay, how long have you been coming here for? She says, well, since I was a little girl, for the last many years. So suddenly, this tourist is looking at her, and the eyes start to light up. Wait a minute. She says, you've been here, you've been visiting for so long. Have you ever met the Queen? So she looks at him and she says, well, I haven't. She points to a security guard. She says, but he has. So the next stage is the guy says, okay, well, can we have a photograph? So he gives his camera to the Queen, and he asks her to take a picture of him standing together with the security guard who has met the Queen. So the Queen took the photo, she gave the camera back. He said afterwards, after they left, The queen says to her protection officer, she says, I would love to be a fly on the wall when he gets back to America, and he shows a friend the picture. So you can see the royalty, you can see them out there, and she's just out somebody having a picnic. There's nothing special, nothing distinct. Again, most people would recognize, but it's not as the queen. So in such a situation, says Rosh Hashanah, there probably says you would not say a bracha. Right? There are other poskim, Rav Ovadia Yosef, Rav Shavais as well, I heard from Rav Shechter as well, who say that no, the bracha would not be said at all on the queen or the king, because it's just a figurehead. There is no real power, no real authority. Even though officially the laws cannot be passed unless the monarch gives it royal assent, but for many centuries that has not been rejected. It's more of a formality now. Another derivative of this question, which then comes up, which Rav Ovadia discusses, which Rav Sternbuch discusses, is what about, if it's not about necessarily the name of royalty, but having that power, would say, for instance, the president of a country, the president of the United States, could you say the bracha over there? And again, there's a little bit of a, what would be the svart to say yes? Well, again, clearly the power of life and death, when you're the president who's democratically elected and there's a whole system of parliament and checks and balances, it does not have that absolute power. On the other hand, some of the poskim mention that the president has the power of clemency. So somebody who is in a country where they have somebody sitting on death row could be executed, and the president has the power to issue that pardon. Therefore, in a sense, has the power of life and death. Rav Sternbuch says that could be something in which to say the bracha. But many other poskim, Rav Ovadia, I think also says not to say the bracha. Rav Shavai says this bracha in our days would not apply at all. He says there's no situation where you could say it. He says the kings and queens, the royalty, are just figureheads. That's just symbolic. He says the presidents of democratically elected countries, well, they're not a king. It's not for. There's also the difference. The idea of royalty is that it's a life appointment. The president is there for 4 years, for 8 years, 1 term, 2 terms. It's by definition limited. He says the whole idea of having a democracy, the whole idea of having a democratically elected leader, that people do not want a king. They do not want a monarch, and therefore that would be another spot to say. No. Furthermore, there are countries in the world where they have maybe kings or maybe presidents, whatever they call them, dictators, who certainly do have the power of life and death in their hands. But that is not Rav Shavai says, we say the bracha, we invoke the word of kavod. He says the idea is of a king who judges with mishpat, in justice and in fairness. But when it's being done in such a way as a tyrant, that is not kavod, that's a bizayon, that is not something that over which we say the bracha. So that is regarding kings and queens, and that's regarding presidents as well. One more point, which Rav Ovadia brings up in his tshuva, which is very interesting, is he says, what about if you saw the king on television? Right? So obviously we don't mean if you see a recording. If you see a recording later on, right, you watched on, let's say Shabbat, you watched the coronation, it took place hours earlier, you're not watching it live, that certainly you would not be able to. But he says, if you were watching live, but you saw them through the TV, would you be able to say a bracha? So his answer there is no. The reason he says no is because he quotes from different sugyot in the Gemara as well, regarding Kiddush Levana, regarding other things, other Brekot HaReiyah, but we understand that you have to see it directly. It's not if you're looking through a reflection or you're looking through a glass or something, that would not be considered as seeing the object. And so too, seeing on TV has enough, which is to make it far removed. Where the question then becomes interesting, and some of the poskim bring up, is okay, if we say that seeing on television does not count as seeing, so what about the bracha of Shechianu? The bracha of Shechianu, which you say after seeing your friend, seeing somebody you're happy to see after 30 days, what if you had seen them in the interim within those 30 days via a screen? So if we say on the one hand, there might be a spot to say that if seeing on a screen is not considered like real seeing, therefore you can't say the bracha, would it work the other way to say that it says if you haven't seen them, and then you could say them? So there were some poskim during COVID who said that when we were enjoying lockdowns and people were literally sitting by themselves for months and could not have any contact with somebody. You saw somebody on a screen, but it wasn't the same thing. And then suddenly you were able to see them again, even if you had seen them, and there was great excitement and hitragshut about that. So there were those who said that even then, having seen them on the screen within 30 days, seeing them in person is something new, and you could say that bracha. Again, nowadays, once things are more or less back to normal, Most of the poskim are a little bit more hesitant about it, or a lot more hesitant about it, because at the end of the day, you've seen the person. It's right. So it wouldn't be enough to say the bracha by itself, but it's enough to lessen the excitement. It's not as if the idea of the bracha of Shechiani, you have not seen, you've not had contact with the person for 30 days, and then you see them. So suddenly there's a great excitement. Having seen them, having met with them, spoken to them in the interim, that may that may mean that it's not sufficient, and therefore the bracha should not be said. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha Omer Tzakadosh Baruch Hu Lezakot Yisrael V'chach B'alem Mitzvot Shnei Amar Adonai Chavetz Man Tzidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadil.